So I'm here today to talk about these two guys, Barney Rosset, owner and publisher of Grove Press, the premier publisher of the 60s, and editor of the Evergreen Review, the premier underground magazine of the 60s. Barney brought us Samuel Beckett, Jean Genet, Bertolt Brecht, Jack Kerouac, Ellen Robbe-Grillet, Pablo Neruda, Octavio Paz, William Burroughs, Frantz Fanon, and Malcolm X, as well as this man here, Henry Miller, Brooklyn-born author, famous for the expatriate underground classics Tropic of Cancer and Tropic of Capricorn. Miller is known as the most censored author in history. I'm not sure if this is true or how these things are precisely measured, but as we'll see from this talk, he certainly deserves to be included in that list. Henry Miller was central to Barney Rosset's more general campaign to end censorship in the United States, at least for the printed word, and to bring the avant-garde, principally the European avant-garde, into the American mainstream. This is the subject of my forthcoming book, which Peggy mentioned, Counterculture Colophon. This project brought me into an extensive number of fascinating archives, and I'll be reading you some material from these archives, principally the Grove Press archive at Syracuse University and Barney Rosset's private papers at the Columbia University special collections, as well as a number of wonderful interviews with the folks, at least the surviving folks, who worked with Barney at Grove Press. So I'll be talking about some of those as well. Can we have the next slide? It's eminently appropriate that I give this talk in this auditorium. Barney Rosset is a Francis Parker School graduate, the class of 1940. He was born and raised in Chicago, the only child of a wealthy Russian Jewish father, an investment banker, and an Irish Catholic mother. He was really a big man on campus in Parker School. He was class president. He was captain of the football team. And he came under scrutiny from the authorities early. I actually have the evaluation that was written of Barney by the Francis Parker principal, Herbert W. Smith, from the 30s. Barney got this using the Freedom of Information Act. The government intelligence services had been paying attention to him since he was relatively young. This document is from 1944. And here is what the principal had to say about Barney when he was in the 10th grade. Still boyish, but a boy of unusual resources, physically, mentally, and emotionally, and likely to develop into a man of unusual poise and depth of feeling, one of the very best, a strong leader, a keen and habitual analyst, decided in his opinions without being intolerant of people who do not hold them, impetuous, courageous, and popular. If he sometimes seems a little melancholy, I believe the cause to be his unusual awareness of what is going on in the world and its far-reaching implications. In other words, in spite of his boyish fire, he is not forlorn, merely thoughtless and gay. He should do work of the highest destination and should be liked, even loved, by many. And here's the concluding paragraph. I believe Barney is the most serious problem and the greatest educational challenge in the 10th grade. He should be very carefully and wisely guided. His brilliance, energy, and powers of leadership must be carried very responsibly. This he has not yet learned. Potentially, since he is an extremist, he is an outstanding fascist or a fair, sensitive, democratic leader. Didn't mention the head of a publishing company. In fact, Barney always attributed his left-wing convictions, his almost fanatical left-wing convictions, to the progressive education that he received here at Francis Parker. It was here that he went into his first foray into radical publishing. Along with his childhood friend Haskell Wexler, he published a mimeograph newsletter which they first called The Communist. This is a mashup of communist and socialist. They later renamed it Anti-Everything. His favorite writers were Nelson Algren and James Farrell. Zhou Enlai was his hero. He studied China, I believe in the 10th grade. And he always regretted that he hadn't been able to fight in the Spanish Civil War. I don't know if there are any graduates from Francis Parker here, but his widow was not able to identify for me the fellow on the right here. Barney is the fellow on the left. So if anyone can help me and Astrid figure that out. Let's get the next slide. So when Barney graduated, he went to Swarthmore College, partly because its recruiter had been an ambulance driver for the Spanish Republicans, and partly because he thought it was close to Vassar, which is where his high school girlfriend had went. The girlfriend broke up with him, and he found solace reading this book, Tropic of Cancer, recommended to him by a classmate. He purchased it under the counter from the legendary Gotham Book Mart in New York City. This is not the version that Barney would have gotten. He got one that was published, that was pirated in Mexico. This is, in fact, the original version of Tropic of Cancer, published in 1934 in Paris by Jack Cahan. The cover was illustrated by the then 14-year-old Maurice Girodias, who we'll return to later, who would become the source of many of the books that Barney published, including Henry Miller in the years after World War II. So when I interviewed Barney twice. He died earlier this year. He told me, I didn't even notice the obscenity. I noticed two things. One, he'd had a terrible breakup with a girlfriend, and that struck home to me. And also, Henry's anti-American stance. All Americans looked alike, talked alike, etc. And in fact, Barney Rosset wrote one of his undergraduate papers on Henry Miller. This was also in the Syracuse archives. And I thought I'd read a little from this paper in order to both get a sense of Barney as a young man, but also to see how central Henry Miller was to Barney's whole career after this. Remember, he's writing this as a 19-year-old undergraduate at Swarthmore College. The paper is called Henry Miller versus Our Way of Life. It begins, war drums are rolling, men are marching, the mechanism of war is being oiled. Great orators talk themselves red, white, and blue in the face, telling us that we must defend our way of life. Perhaps they are right, but first I must ask a question, and that question is, what is there in our way of life that makes it so worthy of defending? And so he turns to Henry Miller. Henry Miller is an expatriate American, and as such, I thought it might be interesting to tell about the impression of America he received upon coming back home after a long absence. Perhaps he cannot decide satisfactorily if our way of life is worth dying for, but at least he can stimulate our thought on the subject. Also, his way of life is very intriguing, although as to exactly what he thinks it is, I am sure I cannot in any way answer completely. So then he talks about him going to Paris. When in Paris, he soon began to starve, but nevertheless, he liked Paris immensely. He felt that he had found a greater independence for himself. He looked upon himself as a completely self-sufficient being. He was the sun, and the rest of the world revolved around him. He decided that he must not hope for anything because he thought that anyone who hoped also must have illusions, and he wanted to have nothing to do with illusions. In Paris, he found a quietness in the streets, which he said was lacking in America. He was able to criticize the world from what he considered an insulated position. And then, when Miller came back, New York seems like an enormous citadel within which fighting is always going on. There is a wild mob which is always killing those around it, but this mob is not made up of real people, Miller says. They are only automatons, and one real man could easily conquer the whole city. Nowhere within the city is there one true place to rest. Nothing looks inviting for quiet and contemplation. And then Barney concludes that more or less is what Henry Miller has to say about America. In other words, our way of life is not worth defending. I do not think that we should take Henry Miller's advice too seriously and bomb ourselves out of existence, but some of his criticisms are quite valid, I believe. And then he concludes with a quote from Miller, and his last line is, "Perhaps our salvation lies in all of us becoming artists." The paper got a B+, or actually, no, I'm sorry, the paper got a B-, and the professor responded, perhaps the jaundice is in the cosmological eye itself, not in the world it sees. As you can imagine, Barney didn't last very long at Swarthmore. He left after a semester. When I ran into him, or when I interviewed him, he actually gave me a copy of this paper in order to refute the argument that I was working on about his book. So I had published an article about Grove Press and the censorship battles, and I had argued that what Barney managed to do was bring modernism into the mainstream by bringing these books which had long been censored and were underground into mainstream availability. And Rosset, actually shaking the paper in my face, said, "This is based much more on aesthetics. To me, it's like quibbling between Catholicism and Protestantism. None of them really interest me. I looked at Tropic of Cancer from a political and social point of view." But nevertheless, as I hope to prove, he wanted to bring the freedoms which he saw available to Miller to the culture at large. And this was in many ways the basis of his mandate, his career at Grove Press. So can we have the... So I'm just going to quickly thumbnail now the intervening years between Swarthmore and arriving in New York. He ran away from Swarthmore, tried to get to Mexico, made it to Florida, came back to Chicago, then briefly went to UCLA to study film, and then the war began. He was drafted. His father, who had connections in the Roosevelt administration, got him into the Army Signal Corps in China. All Barney really wanted to talk about when you interviewed him was China. People will tell you this. It was hard to get him to talk about Grove Press. He was very proud of his days in China. When he came back, he hooked up with an old schoolmate at Parker, Joan Mitchell, who would later become famous as a painter in her own right. They moved to Paris and got married, and then they went to New York. And as they began to float apart, it was Joan who actually hooked Barney up with the Grove Press, which at that point had only published a handful of books. And this would have been in 1951 that that Barney Rosset brought Grove Press for $3,000. So let's have the next one. So I want to talk about two important factors in the publishing world that enabled Grove to become as significant as it was in this time period. The first was the Paperback Revolution, right? This usually traced to 1939 with the founding of pocketbooks, was the development of mass-market paper-bound books, frequently reprints of classics, and frequently marketed to college campuses. And I've depended here a little bit on a book by Kenneth Davis named Two-Bit Culture, and he talks about this period as the last great moment of reading and writing in the West by an identifiable mass cultural constituency, a moment of print apocalypse, so to speak, materially a true culmination of print production and distribution, intersected with unprecedented consumer affluence and appetite, spiritually the last great moment of America's own faith in the word. The other thing that was happening at this time was sort of the last blast of the literary and cultural avant-garde in Paris, especially avant-garde drama, which, as some of you may know, was sort of the market that Grove Press cornered. But there was one exception to this preeminence of Paris, and that was painting. Right? Abstract expressionist painting had shifted the center of gravity in culture, at least in painting, to the Museum of Modern Art in New York and the abstract expressionist circles that Barney had been introduced to by Joan Mitchell. And what happened was Rosset at Grove Press brought all these three things together in what is sometimes seen as the second stage of the paperback revolution, the quality paperback revolution. These are an example of two of those texts. Some of you who are old enough may even recognize them. These were paperback originals. In other words, there had been no prior hardcover published. Both, this is, right, we've got Samuel Beckett and Antonin Artaud. And these books were published, again, primarily for an academic marketplace. And Barney had connections all throughout Paris. He went back to Paris after he bought Grove Press and got connections with Éditions de Menuit, Éditions de Seuil, Jean-Jacques Pauvert, Gallimard, and most profitably, this fellow, Maurice Girodias, who had taken after his father in the years after the war and with a company that he now called Olympia Press. Olympia was well known across Paris at this time for publishing English language pornography in this series here, The Traveler's Companion. But Girodias also published a lot of experimental authors such as Beckett, Burroughs. He published Lolita. And it was when Rosset visited Paris in the mid-50s that he hooked up with Maurice Girodias. Now, I asked Rosset about Girodias when I visited him, and he told me that they had a deep relationship and a very important relationship. Barney's partner in crime at Grove Press, Dick Seaver, called it more of a fragile friendship, and I'll try and illustrate in a little while why this would be so. The parallels between the two men, though, are noteworthy. Both were born to wealthy Jewish fathers and Catholic mothers, although they were raised without adherence to either religion. And in fact, when I asked Barney whether he considered himself Jewish or Catholic, he said that both of them drove him crazy and it made him want to be a communist. Most histories see him as in a sort of tradition of Jewish publishers, and indeed both Girodias and Rosset they both published Henry Miller, and they both were deeply invested in the struggle against censorship. And in this, they were entering into actually what had become something of a tradition of eccentric and frequently Jewish entrepreneurs of erotica in the avant-garde battling against censorship. And indeed, Barney, as he became more successful in ending censorship in the United States, basically cannibalized almost all of the Olympia catalog. And Gerodius had been incredibly sloppy and irresponsible in terms of contracts and arrangements with authors, so he never was able to benefit from this relationship to the degree that Barney was. There was another reason that Barney was able to do this at the time that he was, and this was the case of Roth v. United States in 1957, the first case, actually, in which the Supreme Court actually directly addressed the question of whether obscenity is an exception to the First Amendment. The subject of this law, Samuel Roth, was one of these sort of entrepreneurs of erotica. They've been called pariah capitalists or bookleggers. He was a pirate of Ulysses, as well as Lady Chatterley's lover. And it is significant in this case to know that, in fact, he was found guilty and went to jail. But in the case, a very young associate justice named William Brennan Jr. Wrote the majority opinion, and he provided, first of all, what was considered to be a relatively uniform standard of obscenity for the next, actually for American history up to now, which is whether to the average person applying contemporary community standards, the dominant theme of the material taken as a whole appeals to the prurient interest. Lots of argument about what prurient meant and what that interest might be. But it was actually a footnote in this case that became the focus for First Amendment lawyers and publishers throughout the 60s. And the footnote reads, all ideas having even the slightest redeeming social importance, unorthodox ideas, controversial ideas, even ideas hateful to the prevailing climate of opinion, have the full protection of the guarantees, but implicit in the history of the First Amendment is the rejection of obscenity as utterly without redeeming social importance. So what folks realized was that if you could prove social importance, then you wouldn't be accused of obscenity. So how do you prove social importance? You get experts to say that it's important. And indeed, this was the way that all of these cases proceeded, and I'm going to talk about a few of them, where Barney and other publishers who were fighting against censorship would get literary experts to attest to the literary value or social importance of the texts. And indeed, they increasingly found over the course of the 60s that it was, in many ways, easy to prove that, even if the judges weren't convinced once they got up to the Supreme Court, it would be established. And the main category that Barney worked with and that became established in this period was the category of the modern classic. And here the sort of text, or the foundational text, was James Joyce's Ulysses, which had been exonerated of obscenity in the mid-30s. And what they established in the Ulysses case was that if, on the one hand, you have ancient classics that have proven their worth simply by surviving the test of time, in other words, they're still in print, if you have a modern book, the only way that you can prove that it's a classic is if English professors say that it is, or literature professors, or whoever can be considered to be experts in the field. So one of the things I write about in this book that's interesting, this was sort of the apotheosis of English professors in public in this period, in the sense that they were relied upon to attest to the importance of these books. And Grove worked extremely closely with a variety of professors during this time. Now, the figure who ballasted Grove throughout the 50s and 60s and who established for the public that Grove was actually a publisher with a great reputation. And indeed, it's important to understand that before Barney started to get into the kind of pornographic and obscene work that he wanted to publish, he established Grove as an enormously reputable kind of high cultural institution. And at this time, it was very much a goal of publishers, of small publishers like Barney, to want to find the analog to James Joyce, to want to find your Joyce. In fact, Jack Kahan, who'd published Miller, had hoped that Miller would be his Joyce. Barney was more successful. He discovered Samuel Beckett, and he published all of Beckett's work in America for the entirety of his career. This is the cover here of the 1958 catalog, but he cornered all of avant-garde drama, right? So Grove published Pinter, Ionesco, Genet, Adamov, Brecht, Stoppard, and by the time that Barney started to stage his battle against censorship, he had already established this reputation signified here by Beckett. So let's get the next slide. But he knew he couldn't start with Miller. He knew that Miller was going to be a risk. And so he deliberately decided to start this campaign, which he compared, by the way, to a military campaign, this campaign against censorship, and which he funded basically out of his own private fortune, which he'd inherited from his father. His father died in, I think, 57 or 58. So he decided to start with Lady Chatterley's Lover, because he knew that Lawrence was already established as a well-known, respected, reputable British author, and that this would be more likely to win. He hired a man named Ephraim London, who was a very well-known First Amendment lawyer in Boston, had exonerated Roberto Rossellini's film, The Miracle, of charges of obscenity. And they decided to basically proceed like the Random House had proceeded with Ulysses a generation earlier. That is, to precipitate a customs case and to get enough literary experts behind them that they could prove the value of the book. And Rosset sent out a boilerplate letter to a whole bunch of professors and all kinds of experts saying that he wanted to, gather testimony in order to wage this case. But then he ran into problems with London. They were at a meeting in Boston about Lady Chatterley's Lover, and Barney told me, he said, we were in Boston with a bunch of Lawrence specialists, and we were having lunch at Harvard, and I disagreed with London on something, and he said, well, when you're with me, do what I say. And I said, you're fired. And this is very typical of Barney, by the way. He was an enormously tempestuous and impulsive person. So now he found himself, in the midst of this case, but without a lawyer. And he hired a young man, I believe he was his tennis partner, Norman Mailer's cousin, Charles Rembar. He was known as Cy Rembar. Rembar had never argued a case in court, but he was a quick study. And he read through the text of Roth, and he realized that this would be, a wedge for them. And in fact, Rembar helped Barney defend Lady Chatterley's Lover, as well as Henry Miller's Tropic of Cancer. He also helped defend Fanny Hill in the famous 1966 case. He wrote a lovely book in 1968 called The End of Obscenity, and he's sort of responsible for labeling this decade the end of obscenity, or at least for the printed word. Now, like I said, Rosset had originally intended to precipitate a customs case for Lady Chatterley's Lover, but eventually it ended up being a post office case. And this was felicitous in a way. The post office is a national institution, which means that if you win the case there, you've basically won it across the nation. Also, the post office was still in the grips of what had been known as the Comstock Act, right? This is a late 19th century act which had restricted really most materials with any sexual element at all to them from being circulated in the mails. And so this was an administrative hearing. This was a hearing basically internal to the post office, and Rosset was the first witness to call. And in fact, it's important just sort of here to establish that this was really more about publishers than authors. None of the authors of these books, of course, Lawrence was dead, but Rosset was himself the many times not only the witness, but either the defendant or in some cases the plaintiff in these cases, depending on how they were brought to court. And in fact, the defense for the post office immediately said, well, I don't see why the publisher is of any use here. And it was Rembar who, again referencing another part of Roth, said that the conduct of the publisher is one of the elements that the courts have held relevant in proceedings of this kind. And so, again, Rosset, by emphasizing his reputation and his upstanding conduct, really helped to get these cases through the courts. The two experts that Rembar and Rosset had brought were Malcolm Cowley and Alfred Kazin, both at that time sort of gray eminences of the literary world. And although their expertise was challenged, they repeatedly emphasized how many schools they taught at and how much their knowledge was. They both claimed that Lawrence's intention was to encourage sexual fulfillment in marriage. Indeed, they both claimed that they knew that, in fact, Lady Chatterley would marry her lover after the end of the book, right? So they claimed, expertise in the outcome of the plot. And they also said that, America's becoming increasingly tolerant of sexual explicitness and that Lawrence's text is no longer as offensive as it used to be. Now, in fact, and this was frequently the case, they almost always lost the first case and won on appeal. And Arthur Summerfield, who was Eisenhower's postmaster general, was not convinced, and he issued a departmental decision on June 11th, 1959, concluding that any literary merit the book may have is far outweighed by the pornographic and smutty passages and words, so that the book, taken as a whole, is an obscene and filthy work. So what Rosset did, they sued the New York postmaster, Robert Christenberry, and then they won. They won in U.S. District Court on July 21st, 1959. And in the decision by Judge Frederick Van Pelt Bryant, he affirms, Grove Press is a reputable publisher with a good list, which includes a number of distinguished writers and serious works. Before publishing this edition, Grove consulted recognized literary critics and authorities on English literature as to the advisability of publication. All were of the view that the work was of major literary importance and should be made available to the American public. So this provides a template for what Barney did, not only in terms of the court cases, but also in terms of the marketing of the book. Notice that the book has a very, oh, sorry, stick with that one for a second. The book has a very plain cover, and it includes the court case as well as a bunch of other criticism in it, basically verifying that the book is a respectable work of literary criticism and is legal to publish. And this practice, which again had been started with Ulysses, of incorporating the court decision into the text, was very common, as well as marketing the text in this sort of plain and unsalacious manner. Okay, now you can go to the next. Okay, so in fact, Rosset's goal had always been to publish Henry Miller. He hadn't even really liked Lady Chatterley's Lover. Miller's less explicit work had been published by New Directions, but they had not wanted to publish the Tropics, which were illegal in both England and the United States at this time. But in fact, Miller didn't want to be published, at least initially. Barney went out to California, to Big Sur, where Miller was then. And as he told me, I had tried to get Miller and totally failed. I'd gone to California to Big Sur, and he said no. He said he couldn't stand the idea. If I published it, it would be read by college students, which was, of course, what happened. But eventually, Rosset persisted, and it was with the help of Gerodius that he convinced Miller in 1961 with what at the time was a substantial advance of $50,000 to get to publish Tropic of Cancer. Now, Rosset prepared quite carefully with an enormous battery of critical accolades and critical support, and he was wise to prepare, unlike Lady Chatterley's Lover, so he wasn't able to get a post office case or a customs case. So Tropic of Cancer was suppressed and litigated in numerous venues. There were over 30 court cases across the country and over 50 instances of extrajudicial suppression. At the same time, the book was a bestseller across the country, so it was sort of a cause célèbre and a success de scandale at the same time. And since Barney had agreed to indemnify booksellers against the fines or costs and to handle all legal costs that might arise, he found himself battling really for the very survival of Grove Press. 61 and 62 were intense and sort of marginal years financially for the publisher. And I want to read now just the opening pages of Tropic of Cancer to give an idea of the different kind of a challenge that was posed by this book as opposed to Lady Chatterley's Lover. Some of you may have read this book, and this will be familiar to you. This is the opening page, not the very beginning, but on the opening page. I have no money, no resources, no hopes. I am the happiest man alive. A year ago, 6 months ago, I thought that I was an artist. I no longer think about it. I am. Everything that was literature has fallen from me. There are no more books to be written, thank God. This is not a book. This is libel, slander, defamation of character. This is not a book in the ordinary sense of the word. No, this is a prolonged insult, a gob of spit in the face of art, a kick in the pants to God, man, destiny, time, love, beauty, what you will. So the problem is, how do you prove that a book which claims not to be literature and not to be art is literature and is art? And actually, they were able to do it. So now I'm going to quickly go through 3 trials. There are trials all across the country, and these transcripts are in the Grove Press archives. They're hilarious to read. In fact, they're kind of comic rituals of sanctification. The trials themselves established respectability for Miller, and they were also highly effective promotion for Miller, right? So they helped to buttress sales of the book. First case was in Boston, somewhat inevitably, right? Banned in Boston. Rosset rehired Ephraim London to defend the book, and they got a number of impressive experts, including Mark Schorer, Harry Moore, and Harry Levin. The judge was a profoundly cranky man and had no respect for these people at all. There's some really funny exchanges. Harry Moore tried to prove that the book was religious, so he said it's a religious book in the sense that it has a sense of a religion of life, the sacredness of life, the religion of being a human being. And the judge said, well, that means any person who doesn't commit suicide is religious. And then the prosecution attacked Mark Schorer, who is a professor at Berkeley. He said, "It's said that a rarefied atmosphere exists on the campus of the University of California at Berkeley." And the judge asks, "Well, do you feel he is in an ivory tower and therefore has no contact with ordinary human beings?" Prosecution affirms, "Yes, that is correct, Your Honor. The professor is on a shelf by himself with others." And then the lawyer, London, says, "Well, you know, the judge's life is, if anything, more of an ivory tower." And the judge crankily responds, "We are on the street just the same as, you know, or as much as any other ordinary human being." So the question partly was, who's got the street credentials to judge Tropic of Cancer, right? Who's, on the one hand, it was seen as a work of art, but on the other hand, it was seen, on the one hand, the cases, you were supposed to prove the effect on an ordinary reader, not a super literary reader. And of course, Miller himself claimed to be a sort of writer of the street. So these discussions could get very comical about that. They lost this case, not surprisingly. The judge was completely unconvinced by all of their testimony and found the text to be obscene. Now, this case was actually handled what's called in rem. In other words, the case was against the book itself. In Chicago, and I'm going to dwell a little longer on the Chicago case since we're in Chicago here, the case, it was called Franklin Heyman versus Robert Morris. Heyman was a Northwestern University professor. Robert Morris was the acting police chief of Skokie. And in fact, the Tropic of Cancer was being confiscated across suburban Illinois, and the defendants included a whole bunch of small-town police departments, including Arlington Heights, Skokie, Glencoe, Lincolnwood, Morton Grove, Niles, Des Plaines, Mount Prospect, Winnetka, and Evanston. So this was a huge issue across Chicago. It was in the papers, and it pitted, in fact, the papers against each other. Jack Mabley, who is the columnist for the Tribune, compared Henry Miller to a slut walking down a neighborhood street, half undressed and spewing filth to those near her. And then Hoke Norris of the Sun-Times was a vehement defender of the text and actually appeared as a witness in the case. The case actually provoked the Tribune to rescind its bestseller list because they didn't want to provide free advertising for the book. So the Trib actually said, "We have come to the conclusion that we can no longer publish this list raw. Some of the bestsellers that have appeared on our list were sewer-written by dirty-fingered authors for dirty-minded readers." So Rosset, as you can imagine, was enormously proud of this case. He saw this as a peak moment in his career. As you'll see in a minute, he actually did win the case. I see that time is going quicker than we thought. I have Rosset's whole affidavit here from the Chicago case. And I'll just quickly say that, again, in the beginning of the affidavit, he emphasizes the literary credentials of Grove Press, right? That they're in the quality paperback field, that many of their books have been used throughout the country. He quotes from the Lawrence case saying that, you know, Grove Press is a reputable publisher with a good list, which includes a number of distinguished writers and work. The expert that they got for this case was Richard Ellman, the famous Joyce biographer, professor at Northwestern University, who did testify that it's definitely a work of literary merit and literary importance. And this case, they won. So let's see the next case. So Judge Epstein, who had actually been a friend of Barney Rosset's father from way back, so there was a kind of a sense that this may have gone more their way, affirmed that as a corollary to freedom of speech in the press, there is also a freedom to read. And Rosset printed and circulated thousands of copies of this decision and published a statement in support of freedom to read on the front cover of the July-August 1962 issue of the Evergreen Review. And this is a very important moment in my book because the shift from freedom of speech to freedom to read might seem subtle in some ways, but in many ways it represents a much more populist appeal, right? So the idea now is no longer whether Tropic of Cancer is a masterpiece or not, but it has to do with the right of a free people to decide for itself what it may or may not read. So it was this populist turn in Barney's campaign, I think, that was an extremely significant turning point, and that he himself knew was a significant turning point, which is why he promoted it so much. In fact, though, this was not the end, because this was only established in Illinois, and in fact, this case was overturned by the Illinois Supreme Court. I want to go to one more case. This was in Henry Miller's hometown of Brooklyn. Now, in Brooklyn, they actually did indict both Miller and Rosset for conspiring to write Tropic of Cancer. And I just want to read this. The indictment is an incredibly hilarious document, so I have to quickly read it for you. The defendants on or about between January 1st, 1961 and June 30th, 1962, unlawfully and corruptly conspired, combined, confederated, and agreed together to commit the crime of obscene prints and articles in violation of Section 1141 under a certain scheme and plan whereby the defendant arranged to unlawfully sell, lend, give away, distribute, show, and transmute, and to offer to sell, lend, give away, distribute, show, and transmute certain lewd, lascivious, filthy, indecent, sadistic, masochistic, and disgusting book written and printed under the title Henry Miller, Tropic of Cancer. It was the plan of said conspiracy that said book and printed matter was to be prepared and authored by the defendant, Henry Miller, and was to depict and represent acts and scenes wherein the sexual organs of both male persons and female persons were to be portrayed and described in manners connoting sex degeneracy and sex perversion, and were to be of such a pornographic character as would tend to incite lecherous thoughts and desires. Now, as you can imagine, Rosset first noted that the book had originally been published in 1934, so he would have only been 10 years old when he conspired with Henry Miller to write this book. But it got even funnier than that. Rosset affirms that across the country, the police departments tended to focus on a particular page of Tropic of Cancer as the problem. And I decided I would have to, we have to read some Tropic of Cancer here. And Rosset was asked to read this page out loud to the grand jury in Brooklyn to prove that it was lewd and lascivious in this way. This is page 5. Of Tropic of Cancer. This may be familiar to some of you. Oh, Tanya, where now is that warm cunt of yours, those fat, heavy garters, those soft, bulging thighs? There's a bone in my prick 6 inches long. I will ream out every wrinkle in your cunt, Tanya, big with seed. I will send you home to your Sylvester with an ache in your belly and your womb turned inside out. Yes, he knows how to build a fire, but I know how to inflame a cunt. I shoot hot bolts into you. I make your ovaries incandescent. He feels the remains of my big prick. I have set the shores a little wider. I have ironed out the wrinkles. After me, you can take on stallions, bulls, rams, drakes, St. Bernards. You can stuff toads, bats, lizards up your rectum. You can shit arpeggios if you like, or string a zither across your navel. I'm fucking you, Tanya, so that you'll stay fucked. And if you are afraid of being fucked publicly, I will fuck you privately. I will tear off a few hairs from your cunt and paste them on Boris's chin. I will bite into your clitoris and spit out 2 franc pieces. Everybody in the courtroom laughed, the DA laughed, the judge laughed, and they dropped it, and the grand jury would not indict him. Still, this was not the end because none of these cases were able to appeal to the Supreme Court. Finally, they did appeal a case up to the Supreme Court. It was a Florida case, Grove Press v. Gerstein. And what the Supreme Court did was establish that there had to be national standards, right? They affirmed that the constitutional status of an allegedly obscene work must be determined on the basis of a national standard. It is, after all, a national constitution that we are expanding. And it had been 3 years to the day, really practically, since Grove had initially published this book. This was really, in some ways, the marker of Rosset's success after that. He brought out all of Miller's books, including his Proustian magnum opus, The Rosy Crucifixion, and they sold well. Miller was a bestseller across the country in the 60s. There started a sort of academic industry about him, and he became this sort of representative figure for the sexual revolution. I'm going to go a little quicker now because I see time is going by. Let's go to the next one. Basically, it was damn the torpedoes, full speed ahead for Barney after that. He published every erotic or pornographic work he could get his hands on, including Frank Harris's My Life and Loves, all of the work of Jean Genet, all of the work of the Marquis de Sade, My Secret Life, The Pearl, The Lustful Turk, Last Exit to Brooklyn, Naked Lunch. He started a special club called the Evergreen Club where you could join the underground and get a hold of these books. He plundered the Olympia backlist, published everything that Maurice Girodias had published in the Traveler's Companion series. He bought out the complete stock of a couple of antiquarian booksellers. He hooked up with a couple of sex therapists named Phyllis and Eberhard Kronhausen. Apparently around Grove Press they were known as Syphilis and Eberhard. And they were also erotica collectors, so he got a bunch of books from them that he published over this period. And indeed, eventually he became so insatiable that he actually hired people in the press to write pornography for hire that they would then publish and make up blurbs. One of the blurbs was by G. Howard Guacamole, MD. On the whole, I found this book instructive and entertaining. It is absolutely stuffed with redeeming social value and is a lot of laughs. I'm going to just quickly show the next slide. I don't have time to talk about it. Some of you, if you're old enough, remember what a big deal this movie was. Rosset made an enormous amount of money on I Am Curious Yellow, $14 million. And basically, he started to just squander all the money he could. He started to invest in pornographic film and experimental film and avant-garde film. He bought a huge building on the corner of Bleecker and Mercer Streets and had it completely redone, had a big door in the shape of a G and a private elevator and all. Just really started to, and he also took the company public and made it into a corporation. He was now basically a celebrity. He was profiled both in the Saturday Evening Post and in Life magazine. And he was at the top of his game in 1969. And really had successfully ended censorship for print in the United States. And then it all came tumbling down. There are two sort of moments or two events that I want to focus on to just sort of wind up the somewhat abrupt ending of Grove Press. One was the publication, both of these have to do obviously with the emergence of second wave feminism and women's liberation. The first was the publication of a book, Kate Millett's Sexual Politics. Some of you may remember this book. It attacks in particular Grove Press authors, both Lawrence and Miller. And indeed, she called Miller a compendium of American sexual neuroses. His value lies not in freeing us from such afflictions, but in having had the honesty to express and dramatize them. And it's actually really dramatic, the degree to which Miller's reputation plummeted after the publication of this single book, right? He had been gone basically from seeming like a representative of sexual liberation to being seen as epitomizing male sexism, male repressiveness, male adolescent perversion. And the book was, Millett appeared on the cover of Time magazine. The book was seen as this, right, one of the great sort of militant forays representative of the transformation that was wrought by second wave feminism. More directly, though, there was a strike and a takeover at Grove Press. Robin Morgan, who was a feminist activist in the 60s, actually was also an associate editor or an assistant editor at Grove Press, and she tried to organize a union at Grove, and then on April 13th, 1970, she led a group of women to take over the offices on Mercer Street. Her book, Sisterhood is Powerful, was in press at the time. This, of course, has her famous sort of valedictory to the New Left, goodbye to all that. She was, in fact, the only Grove employee involved in the takeover. It was a group of other women that she got in, and they put together a manifesto that in many ways is rhetorically similar to Goodbye to All That, for those of you who remember that. It's a series of statements starting with goodbye to, goodbye to. Instead, here it's no more using of women's bodies to rip off enormous profits for a few wealthy capitalist dirty old straight white men such as Barney Rosset. No more mansions on Long Island for boss man Rosset and his executive yes man flunkies, segregated mansions built with extortionist profits from selling the autobiography of Malcolm X, and no more Latin American executive junkets for the rich men who sell the books of Che, Bosch, Debray to get rich while the Latin cities they visit are choked with hungry babies. Rosset was actually in Copenhagen collecting erotic films when this happened. He called Grove to see how things were happening, and they said that the women had barricaded themselves in his office. Rosset was particularly concerned about his private correspondence, and so he tried to tell his associates to get the women out of the office. They would not. He said to call the police. The women insisted on women police coming, and apparently New York City couldn't find any women cops to get them out of there. So he called the actual police, and they came and carried the women out of the office. And as you can imagine, the spectacle of handcuffed women being removed from the Grove Press offices by the New York City police permanently damaged the company's reputation and divided its constituency. A bunch of people quit. A bunch of people marched outside. In the end, the employees did decide not to join the union. It was actually the Fur, Leather, and Machine Workers Joint Board of Amalgamated Meat Cutter and Butcher Workers of North America. And as you can imagine, the Grove Press workers didn't, in fact, have a lot of class affiliation with that group. But Grove went into a complete tailspin. The company lost $2 million in a single year. Rosset fired 70 employees, vacated the Mercer Street offices. In December of '71, he had to end publication of the Evergreen Review. By 1973, the stock was worthless. By 1974, he was working out of a tiny office on 11th Street with a staff of 14. So for all intents and purposes, this was the end of the publisher. He limped along for another decade, but its significance was over. In fact, as I argue in the book, Grove laid the groundwork for its own demise. The campaign against censorship that Rosset had spearheaded had in the end left him behind. He'd gone from avant-garde to arrière-garde, from hero to villain, but the decline in his personal fortunes must be understood in terms of the success of the collective project he was so instrumental in enabling. He had almost single-handedly precipitated the end of obscenity, but the result was a battle over the politics of pornography that he was ill-equipped to engage. And this is all from my forthcoming book, May 2013, on Grove Press. It's not available yet, but there are pre-order forms out in the lobby if you want to get yours early. This is just from a short piece of it. There's a lot of other elements of the Grove Press story that I tell there. But it was really a wonderful honor to tell this part of the story here in the school that Barney really credited with, being the reason that he lived the life he lived in the first place. So thank you all for coming. I guess we have 10 minutes for questions. I was told I have to moderate the questions. So there are these microphones here. If anyone has, I'm happy to take the next 10 minutes if someone wants to ask.
When does the book go on sale?
May 2013. It should be in bookstores.
Did he ever meet Lenny Bruce?
He was I don't know whether I don't think that they met, but he told me that he loved Lenny Bruce and he wanted to help Lenny Bruce in any way that he could. They wanted to publish a bunch of transcripts of Lenny Bruce trials in the Evergreen Review, but by that time, Lenny Bruce was racked with paranoia and was already going into his kind of weird psychological seclusion. So I don't think they met, but he was a great fan and really wanted to, and actually it was Ephraim London who was Bruce's lawyer for most of that time. We talked a little bit about Bruce, and he saw Bruce as a tragic figure and really wished he could have supported him more.
One more question was his business acumen versus his personal railing against censorship.
That's a fascinating question, and I actually struggled a lot with this when writing the book because initially, I wanted to say that Barney was a terrible businessman, but just had this kind of charisma that brought people together. And a couple of people reading early drafts told me that it sounded like he actually made a lot of very acute and intelligent business decisions. He had extremely good instincts, and actually what I ended up saying is that he also knew how to find the talent of others. You don't get a sense of this in this talk, but Grove was actually a crew. It was a community of people, and they all loved and hated Barney at the same time, and they worked very hard for him, and they were a little bit more sober, rational types. So the business ran partly because Barney had good instincts, but he was incredibly impulsive, and other people sort of worked to try and enact his vision or enable things to happen. The other thing that's important in this, there were always rumors of Barney's wealth, and in fact, some people claim that he was able to get credit because there were rumors of his wealth. And it wasn't until, I think I'm the first person to have seen this, so all the financial records are in Barney's private files, and in fact, he was very wealthy. He had millions of dollars that he inherited from his father. So the other thing about Grove is that there was a lot of latitude in terms of how much money it would lose, and in fact, it lost money until probably 65 or 66, but he had an enormous cushion, and it's important to note that he died fairly poor. He basically dumped his entire fortune into this endeavor. But the whole question of what it means that Grove is a business, and whether he was a good businessman, and what it means to be a literature professor writing about a businessman, I struggled a lot with that in the book, and this was a lot of the revisions had to do with trying to deal with that question.
I'm here in part because I survived smuggling Henry Miller's Tropic of Cancer and Capricorn in the early 60s for a friend from Paris. But I'm thinking how far we've come
Yes.
since those times, and yet all over the country, there are groups that are working very hard to censor books in
Yes.
schools
Yes.
For various reasons and different agendas. And I'm wondering if you could, I know it's a very broad question, but can you address at all what the parallels might be and what the differences are, and whether you think these groups can get anywhere, given the climate of our country?
It's a fascinating and as you know, difficult and broad question. I mean, there's one way of looking at the 20th century and seeing it as an enormous triumph for the battle against censorship. And certainly in terms of national or official legal censorship of printed works, I think we can say we've achieved an enormous amount of freedom. On the other hand, it does appear to be a perennial battle that happens over and over again. I think the focus on the media has shifted so much, and the internet really appears to be the sort of realm in which the struggle is playing out. What sometimes astonishes one, though, is that the terms, the rhetorical terms of the debate don't seem to have changed. In other words, there's a sort of echo chamber when you see these battles. What the people on both sides say does seem to echo what happened here. In the period I'm talking about. In some ways, I feel like there's also a more counterintuitive way I look at this, where some of the bite of print has been taken out by the fact that I'm so free. You know, I can teach any of this stuff now. I don't get into any trouble for no matter how explicit what I teach is. And my students are relatively inured to it. It's hard to shock them. They're not really troubled by any of this, at least not on the terms that it was before. And there's a way in which the very power of print has receded since this happened, and I feel like it's in many ways in other media that the battle is going on. But First Amendment lawyers will tell you that you have to be eternally vigilant, that this is just an ongoing battle. And I think most of them will also tell you that for whatever complaints they have about the Supreme Court, that we're lucky we have the Constitution and the First Amendment, and that it, I brought Nadine Strassman in for a conference I had on obscenity a few years ago, and I don't know whether she was staging or performing optimism or really was optimistic, but she seemed quite confident actually that the Supreme Court, which we may have complaints about in other ways, can be relied upon to overturn. I mean, the real sort of holdover that I see right now is network television and radio, where the FCC versus Pacifica, where there still are actually, right, the indecency limits. She seemed pretty confident that those would be overturned. But there does appear to be a way which, particularly in the English-speaking world, this is a perennial battle which seems to be restaged periodically on the same terms, and we can only consider ourselves lucky that we have a written document which sort of provides us with a kind of constant reference point. And Barney Rosset, it's helpful to look at the campaign he ran, which was run again, it was run quite well. It could only have been run by a wealthy man. I think that's the other thing that we have to say, is that other people got thrown in jail because they didn't have the money, to hire all these lawyers and do all of this.
When you brought up television, it reminded me of a couple of shows that I've had the good fortune to see over in England called The Thick of It and Fresh Meat. And they are very much different than what you can see in American television. With
Yes.
Globalization, do you think as these things come over the pond and from other influences, that what you just said about television, maybe television itself may be changing for the future?
That was actually one of the questions that we wanted to raise in the conference I had, is the ways in which the globalization of culture is affecting these debates. One of the things that fascinated me when I was preparing for that conference, and when we were putting together we put together a little anthology called Obscenity and the Limits of Liberalism, which has some of the papers. And one of the things I found is that in English-speaking countries, it's still a ritual to have a case over Lady Chatterley's lover, right? So India, Japan, Australia, I'm not sure about New Zealand, but there's a way in which it became a sort of symbolic of entering into some kind of modernity to have an obscenity case over Lady Chatterley's Lover. And the way in which the globalization of English may be affecting that is an interesting question about the future. But I think I would answer something a little bit similar to where I did before, that it's surely not going to be in print, right? It's going to be about other media and principally visual media, I would say. But the degree to which Anglo-American legal systems are going to dominate this, that's a real question, and I'm actually not, I mean, we'll have to see.
At some point in your talk, you used the term masterpiece, and I wonder if you think either of the novels, Lady Chatterley's Lover or Tropic of Cancer, is a masterpiece, and as a writer and a teacher, does it matter to you?
Right. That's an excellent question. You know what? I really am sick and tired of Lady Chatterley's Lover and Tropic of Cancer. I don't read them again when I teach them anymore, and I'm not even sure how much I liked them when I initially read them, although sometimes I get into them. In one way to answer your question is to say that the term masterpiece became oversaturated precisely in this period. It became a way of marketing any old book, and basically canonization happened so quickly that the term got cheapened through its overuse. I would still use masterpiece for Ulysses, but in a weird way, my literary values don't turn on that. I care less about whether a book is a masterpiece than whether it interests me maybe for a variety of other reasons. But I will say that I think that one other angle of looking at the story I told there is it's a story of where, because it used to be that works took a while to get canonized, right? They would write, I mean, even Ulysses or Flaubert, right? These works, they come out and they're celebrated by a small group, and then they slowly become canonized, and the masterpiece is kind of a designation that accrues as critical reception happens. And what happens now is, Toni Morrison writes a book and it's immediately a masterpiece before it's even come out, or anyone. I mean, any example. So the term itself has become diluted to the point where it's a little harder to lay claim to it. But my take on Lawrence and Miller has always been far more ambivalent than Barney's. Well, Barney didn't like Lawrence either. Barney's affection for Miller, and indeed anyone's affection for Miller. There are some, when you teach Miller, 80% of the class will hate it, and then there'll be these people who are just huge fans, and just, Miller changed their life, or they love Miller, or they, it's a subject possibly for another book. What personality types glom on in that way. Thank you.